Today, we're diving into a fascinating historical puzzle, one that takes us all the way back to 7th century Arabia, right to the city of Medina at the very dawn of Islam. And it kind of challenges a story that's been told for centuries. And we're going to kick things off by asking a really direct question. Who exactly were the people that the early Islamic sources call the Jews of Medina? Now, that seems like a pretty simple question, right? But the answer, well, according to some modern scholarship, it's a whole lot more complicated than you might think. Okay, let's frame this whole investigation with a quote that just gets right to the heart of it. One source puts it this bluntly: Muhammad waged a war against what he thought were Jews, but were in fact Arabian monotheists. Wow. I mean, that one sentence just flips the entire script, doesn't it? It completely reframes the conflict and opens up this huge historical question. So let's get into it. Section 1, the mystery itself. We're going to explore a scholarly argument that really questions the basic identity of the groups that Muhammad and his followers met when they first arrived in Medina. All right, so the traditional story, the one you'll find in all the early Islamic texts, seems pretty straightforward. It tells us about three major groups in Medina: the Banu Qaynuqa, the Banu Nadir, and the Banu Qurayza. And it calls them Jewish tribes. Simple enough, right? I mean, that's been the accepted narrative for, over 1,000 years? But is that the whole story? Let's move on to the evidence. Scholars who are making this case for misidentification, they aren't just pulling this out of thin air. They base it on some very specific inconsistencies. So we're going to look at 4 key points that they bring up. And here they are. First, how their society was structured. Second, the names they used. Third, the specific religious words in their vocabulary. And fourth, how they acted politically when they were facing a common threat. You put all these together, and they form the core of this argument that these groups weren't exactly who we thought they were. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's break down those first 2 points. The argument goes that Jewish communities back then, they just didn't typically organize themselves into big tribes like this. And on top of that, just look at the names: Qaynuqa, Qurayza, Nadir. These are not Hebrew names. And this is a huge deal because historically, when people converted to Judaism, they took on Hebrew names. We just don't see that happening here, which really suggests a different cultural background. And the other 2 points? Just as compelling. Theologically, these groups apparently called God Rahim, which means the compassionate. Now, of course, compassion is a divine attribute in Judaism, but using Rahim as a primary name for God just wasn't standard Jewish practice. And then there's the political side. When things got tough, the 3 tribes didn't team up. They were basically picked off one by one. This lack of solidarity is seen by some historians as really uncharacteristic of Jewish communities, who, as minorities, usually had to stick together to survive. So, okay, the external evidence definitely raises some questions. But what if the biggest clue has been hiding in plain sight this whole time, right inside the primary text of Islam itself? Let's turn to the Quran, because it makes a subtle but really powerful distinction. You know, it's fascinating. The Quran itself seems to give us a clue here, because it uses 2 different terms. First, you have Banu Israel, or the children of Israel. This term shows up mostly in the earlier revelations from Mecca, and it's used to describe the historical Israelites from the Bible. But then, when the story shifts to Medina, the text almost exclusively starts using al-Yahud, or the Jews, for the groups living there at that time. So why the change in terminology? It really suggests the Quran itself might be drawing a line between the 2. And this is where the story takes a really wild turn. To even begin to understand who these groups in Medina might have been, we have to zoom out. I mean, way, way out, from 7th century Medina to look at the deep, ancient linguistic history of the whole region. So get this. The argument some scholars are making is pretty incredible. That the Hebrew language itself has deep roots in ancient Arabia. From this perspective, you can't actually fully understand biblical Hebrew unless you understand the ancient dialects that were being spoken on the Arabian Peninsula, centuries, maybe even millennia before. Now, to really grasp this, we need to talk about a key concept called etymological orthography. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just when a language keeps old spellings even after the way we say the word has changed. A perfect example is the silent K in the English word knife. We keep it because it points to the word's older origin. While scholars argue that Hebrew does the exact same thing, and that its silent letters and other spelling quirks are actually artifacts pointing back to a much older written Arabian language. So the big question is, can this connection actually solve a real biblical mystery? Is it possible that by looking at an ancient Arabian language, we can clear up something that's always been murky in Hebrew? Well, according to this research, the answer is a resounding yes. Okay, you have to see this. It's a fantastic aha moment. Take the biblical name Joash. In Hebrew, its meaning is, well, it's obscure. No one's really sure. But then scholars found this name, Yesa, in an ancient Arabian inscription, and they realized, wait a second, this is just Joash with the parts flipped around. The root of Ysa is an ancient Arabic word aus, which means he gave. And just like that, the name makes perfect sense. Yahweh gave. A Hebrew mystery is solved by looking at an ancient Arabian dialect. I mean, if that's not a linguistic smoking gun, I don't know what is.
So, after all that, where does this leave us? Well, it kind of forces us to rethink the neat little boxes we like to put ancient peoples into. We might be looking at a history that was much more tangled, much more fluid than we ever imagined.
So let's think about it. If the Hebrew language itself has roots this deep in Arabia, then it stands to reason that the peoples we call Israelites and Arabs might not have been these two totally separate groups. Instead, this evidence points to a shared common origin, with identities that were way more complex than later traditions would have us believe. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of what we've gone over in this explainer. The identity of the Jews of Medina is a real historical puzzle, and it's a hot topic of debate for scholars. We've seen evidence from their social structure, their names, and their theology that challenges the traditional story. We saw how the Quran itself seems to use different terms for the historical children of Israel and the people living in Medina at the time. And finally, these deep linguistic ties suggest this shared ancient Arabian origin that just blurs all the rigid lines we thought existed. And that brings us to our final thought. This whole journey into the deep past, it shows us a world where identities were fluid and interconnected and layered in ways we're just beginning to understand. So if the ancient lines we thought were so sharp and clear were actually pretty blurry, what does that tell us about the identities, the certainties, and the divisions we hold on to so tightly in our own world today?